A few short years ago, the average enthusiast would have told you that you were crazy if you said you wanted to put top-of-the-line hardware, especially graphics cards, in a tiny little box like this one. Now, the GPU makers are practically begging for it by designing little tiny flagship class graphics cards, so the only question that remains then is this: AMD or Nvidia for your elite flagship class small form factor gaming PC? Vote for turnip. It's a shirt. I don't have one, so we're going to do our best to demo what it looks like. And this is not what the real shirt looks like. It looks a little more like this, but we didn't have a sample to show you guys, so this had to do. You can stay tuned after the outro for bonus footage of the creation of this masterpiece, if you're into that sort of thing. Now, today's video will focus on thermals, form factors, and the compromises that we need to make when deciding between the GTX 980 Ti and the Radeon R9 Fury X. But as you all know, there's actually more to the story than just degrees Celsius and FPS these days, with FreeSync and G-Sync technology having a huge impact on the gaming experience. So drop a like under the video if you'd like to see us put these two techs head to head very soon to see which one delivers the most responsive, lag-free gaming experience. For now though, I'll introduce the test bench. Inside a Silverstone SG13 case, the same one from this video, where we put an 18-core CPU and a Titan X inside it, we'll be cramming not necessarily the highest end hardware, but rather what I would consider to be a very reasonable, yet premium gaming PC. So we've got a 4670K CPU, not overclocked, 16 gigs of Corsair Vengeance RAM, the rather unique SX500 500 watt SFX-L power supply from Silverstone, and an Asus Maximus 6 Impact. Then we'll be testing that config in two different ways. For the first test, we've got a reference GTX 980 Ti, actually the same one we reviewed back here. So this isn't a water-cooled graphics card, which means we can use the radiator mounting point in the front of the case for our CPU, in our case a Corsair H80i. Then for our second configuration, I swapped out the video card, which actually was a surprisingly complicated ordeal that involved removing the power supply, removing the graphics card, removing the CPU cooler, removing the motherboard to install an air cooler on the CPU since we no longer have room for our CPU all-in-one liquid cooler, and reassembling everything to replace our 980 Ti with the Fury X, whose form factor I wasn't really sure about until, well, now that I've actually used it. I mean, I still don't know how much sense it makes for some cases, but in the SG13 anyway, it feels like the PCB space that AMD saved with their on-package HBM memory was exactly enough to compensate for the extra space consumed by the water cooling tubing sticking out the back of the card and the radiator that needs to be in the front of the case now. So let's run through which of these setups performed better. Please note that I consider this testing to be pretty much a worst case scenario for all hardware involved, since the ambient temperatures are significantly over 30 degrees Celsius in here. First up is CPU temps. I used IDA64 CPU test to load up our 4670K, and the GTX 980 Ti rig, thanks to its CPU liquid cooling, is the clear winner here, with the CPU topping out at a frosty 64 degrees. By contrast, our small form factor heat pipe cooler had the CPU at a still not technically dangerous, but much less impressive 87 degrees Celsius, and that is without the GPU under load. Next up is a result that I actually didn't expect. Motherboard temperatures are an often overlooked yet super important part of maintaining a stable PC. And while gaming, our 980 Ti configuration actually ran away with this one. But I also wouldn't read too much into it, because both are well within safety margins, and depending on the position of the motherboard's thermal sensor, sometimes just a hotter running CPU can result in a much higher reading for the motherboard, even if airflow around the socket from the CPU heatsink is more than adequate. Which leads us to idle noise impressions. None of the whining that I've heard tales of online is present in either our old dead Fury X or our new Fury X samples. But since both configurations were equipped with cheap pumps, and I mean, I'm not saying that to be mean to all-in-one liquid coolers or anything, it's just that you're getting what you pay for when you spend $100 on a D5, they both had a little bit of, pump noise. But both were satisfactorily quiet in my opinion. But what about load while gaming? Well, the Fury X and 980 Ti configs were actually not noticeably more or less annoying to my ears than each other. They're both cooled by a grade A fan on their radiators in each configuration, a Gentle Typhoon or an NFF12 that handles most of the airflow through the case, and neither card exhibited any bothersome coil whine for more than the first couple seconds of gameplay in Crysis 3 on the Fury X. But this, my friends, is where things get really interesting. The 980 Ti did its usual cap at 83 degrees thing, while the Fury X stayed at a very cool 67 degrees. Nothing unexpected here. I mean, it is water-cooled. Of course it was going to win that. But the interesting thing here is that the Fury X actually managed to score 5% higher in our Crysis 3 benchmark at 2560 by 1440 with very high textures and system spec with anti-aliasing disabled and motion blur disabled as well. What? R9